Hello, hello. Welcome back to the P2P Soap Box. I'm your host and your P2P BFF, Marcie Maxwell. It's hard to believe, but we are already at the end of our 4th season of the P2P Soap Box. After this episode, we'll be taking a short break, but don't worry, we'll be back again in September. And we've got a timely topic to round out the season. Whether it be a natural disaster, a PR crisis, or a political challenge, it seems like there is always another crisis around the corner. So how does that impact our peer-to-peer campaigns? And how do we prepare for the inevitable? Crisis fundraising really operates on a completely different timeline than traditional campaigns. When disaster strikes, our organizations have a critical 24-hour window to mobilize resources and activate our networks. But what separates the organizations that thrive in crisis from those that scramble? The difference lies in preparation, having systems, messages, and community relationships ready before the emergency unfolds. It's about building infrastructure that can pivot quickly while maintaining donor trust and emotional resonance throughout rapidly evolving circumstances. So today, I am talking with Jessi Woomer, Director of Digital Fundraising for the American Red Cross. The American Red Cross prevents and alleviates human suffering in the face of emergencies by mobilizing the power of volunteers and the generosity of donors. With 10 years of experience leading national digital fundraising strategy, Jessi knows exactly what it takes to turn crisis moments into sustainable support through peer-to-peer strategies. So whether your organization is built for disaster response or you're just preparing for the unexpected, Jessi's insights will help you understand how to harness urgency without losing sight of long-term relationships. Together, we dive into the critical first 24 hours, smart donor targeting during chaos, and how to transition from emergency response to meaningful stewardship. So let's get started with my conversation with Jessi Woomer of the American Red Cross. Jessi, welcome to the P2P Soap Box.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
We are so happy to have you on here. I know your topic at our last conference was a big hot topic about disaster fundraising. And so I am eager to dig into that. But first of all, I just would love to hear a little bit about your personal and professional journey that led you to your current role at the American Red Cross.
Sure. Well, I started at the Red Cross about 10 years ago. I was working in our Boston chapter in the Massachusetts office as a local marketing manager. And when I was in that job, I was just trying to say yes to taking on interim roles whenever turnover would happen or people went on maternity leaves, to professionally develop myself and see what role would maybe best fit my strengths and where I wanted to be my career. So most notably, during that time, I worked as a communications manager. And then I filled in as the Team Red Cross lead for the Boston Marathon. That's where I really learned about the world of peer-to-peer. And that led me to a role at our national headquarters, where I was supporting our events and then eventually leading our peer-to-peer programs. And then I eventually took on social fundraising as well as live streaming and influencer work. And now I am in a director role and I lead a small but mighty team of 4.
So organizations like American Red Cross, they're really built for crisis response, right? And that's not necessarily the traditional organizations that have relied on peer-to-peer. So a lot of our organizations that are health-based or education-based or community-based, what do you think they can learn about being ready to fundraise when a disaster strikes? And as you know, disaster can mean a lot of different things. It can mean an environmental disaster. It can mean a political disaster, a community disaster. There's a lot of different ways that disaster can strike. So what can they learn about kind of being ready to fundraise in a moment's notice?
Yeah. So it's first and foremost really important to have a plan in advance of this disaster or crisis occurring. I know it doesn't sound fun to write a plan for something that hasn't happened yet, but you can keep that plan broad and outline roles and responsibilities without actually having names next to them. So just being ready to share messaging and collect donations, supporting your fundraisers within likely hours of that crisis event is pretty critical. So for us, this allows us to remain relevant and follow our peak news cycle, which is going to be a really important timeline for you during a crisis. So if you can't stand something up within a few days, you're probably too late. So really having that plan in advance is going to help. We see the majority of fundraising happen within the first few days after a disaster strikes for us. And within the first week of our fundraising, the numbers really start to drop. And around the 2-week mark, we're generally starting to shut things down. So this timeline, of course, depends on the disaster or the crisis. But I will say you generally don't see the media focus on many things beyond a 2-week mark. So my best advice is to not wait for the right photos or don't wait for the perfect thing to say. Don't go back and forth too much on the content because speed is really your most critical piece during a crisis.
Yeah. So after your presentation at our conference, I had a conversation with an attendee who works for a local hospital in Florida. And she just said, we're not an emergency response, but we live somewhere where hurricanes hit
Absolutely.
every year. And she goes, and our patients are impacted, our staff are impacted. And she said, all I could think was, yes, we should have something put up in place and ready to go so that when that happens, we can respond and fundraise to help our constituents. And she said, I think of it kind of as having an umbrella, right? You say, if you carry an umbrella, it won't rain, right? So when it comes to that, like that planning ahead, let's talk a little bit more about like, what are the resources and systems that you are putting in place before a disaster event even happens?
So one of the most important things I'd say we have that we really take for granted is we've always had a disaster fundraising team. And for your organization, maybe this could be called something like a crisis task force. This group of individuals manages the disaster from the fundraising side for us. They ensure every single day that everyone in fundraising and in communications has updated statistics. They have service delivery numbers and any changes to the weather. If the disaster is still occurring, they partner with the weather service. So they provide us approved photography, approved language, shared resources. They really make sure everyone's aligned, and they provide just basically a governing body for questions. This is pretty critical so that everyone has the same information. They all have the same point of contact. And if you're setting this up for your organization, I'd just start with maybe the roles that the task force will have. And like I said before, you could just fill in those names later when the crisis actually occurs. But you're going to want to make sure it's someone that's in a leadership role that can communicate out organization-wide, but also someone who can drop everything and focus solely on this during an emergency, because it really is a full-time job. Another thing we do is we make sure that we have standard operating procedures written, or SOPs, for every single channel. There's that way, no matter what, and no matter who's in the role or what's going on at the organization, sometimes disasters or crises happen on a weekend, and that person who's usually in that job isn't the one that's answering your phone call. So whoever's standing in to help, the steps to activate that channel can really easily be followed. And then last, but definitely not least, probably the most important, is we live and breathe our disaster playbook during a disaster. So this playbook is in Excel, if it ain't broke. And it is a living document. So we track results from all of our channels. We do that daily so that we can see trends, and it helps us inform our decisions and track our historical data. The playbook not only tracks our activity, but activity like if we turned on a Facebook fundraiser at this date and this time, but also tracks revenue on a daily basis. So we can see what other channel owners are doing in real time, and we can stay consistent across all of our channels. We can also see all of the data to decide what to do next. So we can see what channels are rising in revenue or what channels are not doing well in revenue and what to pivot. And this playbook is amazingly helpful during a disaster while we're all working at probably warp speed. It's also helpful afterwards because we share our learnings and recommendations, and we really use the learning tab on this playbook to adapt for the future. I'd say every disaster we have It's just a little bit different because they're all unique in their own way. And we learn something new every single time, even though we've been doing this for decades.
You talked about how critical it is to start fundraising within 24 hours, which I that makes so much sense. And I think for non-emergency response organizations, that feels very daunting because even the most nimble organizations, 24 hours to set up a website, get everybody on board. You mentioned getting the right pictures, everybody to agree on messaging. That is hard, right? Like that is who's the decision maker. So how do you move that quickly? And, what else does it take behind the scenes in terms of just your teamwork and to make that happen?
Yeah, I will say it took us years to get there. First thing we do is we make sure we have someone on call on weekends and nights, or at the very least have someone's cell phone number of someone who could stand something up or delegate standing something up. If someone goes on vacation, we make sure they put in charge someone during their absence who could fill in if a disaster strikes. This means it's really important to cross-train your team so you're not just reliant on one person. Disasters, unfortunately, don't always occur during the usual 9 to 5. For some reason, they keep happening on Fridays. Just waiting for that work day to start really loses that critical fundraising time when the disaster is really high in the news cycle. Which is pretty much free marketing for that event. So there's an expectation at our organization that we might need to get something online just outside of normal hours, and that's understood just by working here. But that being said, we've worked really hard to make sure everything is turnkey and it doesn't take too much time to set up. So like I mentioned before, every channel has an SOP and there should really be no questions on how to set up your channel. The instructions are very clear and we have templates created to make everything really fast. So we have email templates, peer-to-peer campaign templates, redcross.org, website page templates, etc., pretty much for every channel. So it shouldn't take more than like an hour or two to do that actual work to turn on the channel, but we do all have personal lives, so we try to have it all turned down within 12 to 24 hours. Just to, we don't always have a computer with us or can't get a hold of someone. Yeah. So the playbook also has a template that I mentioned before. So we just duplicate that Excel file every time, and it helps us remember what needs to be done, and we can check off things when they're completed, which really eliminates that back and forth of, did you do this yet? And helps directors and VPs just be able to open up a document instead of communicate with all those channel owners potentially on a weekend.
Yeah. Well, I think it sounds like a very simple idea of simply having somebody on call. It seems so like an obvious thing. I can remember a specific situation where, again, we had our managing a walk program, and all the walks were on the same day, and they were just expecting some weather. And we had to get out a message because a handful of events were going to have to be canceled. And there was one person who could trigger the emails. And I think like her in-laws were in town and she was at dinner, like on a Friday night, and we could not get her. So we sat for not that long, but it was probably like 90 minutes where we're like waiting to get this message out because I don't want to call it a failure, but we did. We had a single point of failure in getting that communication messaging out. And so I think about some of our organizations where, they have a lot of events on the same weekend, or it's a really critical month. Do you have tech support on call? Do you have marketing and digital teams kind of on call for the weekend of your biggest events? If something comes up, again, emergencies can strike in a lot of different ways. How do you quickly align the resources to pivot on something like that? So you're not just frantically making a phone call, but calling someone is going to be responsible for helping you out for that weekend. So I think it seems like the simplest takeaway, but I think could be relevant to a lot of people.
Yeah, those SOPs are helpful, but I'd say cross-training too is so critical because people need logins and they need access. And I make sure at least two of my staff members can do each other's job at any given time, even just for like PTO or taking a day off. You want to make sure that things can get done, and not relying on one person. We all have small staffs. So
Exactly.
some people are going to have to
Exactly.
learn to do something that's maybe not their job so that someone else can go take some time off. Yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit about kind of messaging and targeting of donors during a crisis. So I know this came up, I'll use the example of, the recent LA wildfires, right? Clearly, there is a group of people who are the most impacted by the disaster. However, they are actively being impacted by the disaster. So when you think about targeting for donations during a crisis, are you focusing on those who are going to need the help or those who are watching kind of from outside the affected areas?
That's a great question. So segmentation is really, really key during a disaster, just to ensure that we have respectful communication. I mean, first and foremost, our messaging always has language on where people can get help, whether it's a fundraising ask or not. We're always prioritizing the response and making sure everyone knows where to find safety and food and shelter first, of course. But if we're looking at a large disaster, we activate all of the channels as fast as we can, but the channels we're communicating in informs how sensitive we need to be and what audiences we want to suppress. So if it's a direct ask with their name on it, we want to suppress those who are affected. Or generally that whole area that was affected, because you generally don't know who's affected in the beginning of the disaster. But if it's something they might see on a less direct channel that we don't generally use their name, we won't apply those suppressions. So just to go with your LA wildfire example, we would probably never want to send like a direct mail piece to someone who lives in Los Angeles. Like, what if their house burned down and then they received a donation ask in their PO box with their name on it? That would be so insensitive. So we do sometimes send direct mail pieces for large disasters, but we always suppress those areas because of that reason. But in opposition, you could do a social media ad or a display ad to those in the Los Angeles area with a donation ask, and that would be acceptable because it's not being sent directly to them. It's showing up as an ad on their account without their name on it. And social media also allows them to forward it to others. And a lot of people do care about how they can help. And people who are affected want to share ways to help because that's close to them. So social and display and places that are a little more digital and less personal are a little more sensitive to send to those areas. And then obviously those people that are closest to the disaster are going to have the most interest in that content, but it's a really fine line between targeting where the crisis is relevant and being insensitive. So at the end of the day, our main priority is to help those affected by disasters. So we always make sure we're sharing out those resources on how to get help. But the fundraising piece requires a lot more like nuance and decision making based on how to stay relevant, but also respectful.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's also so important as you're a part of your emergency plan is how does this impact your other campaigns that might be ongoing? So I think about, again, another example. I remember managing a walk program and when Superstorm Sandy hit, the East Coast several years ago. And, we were just kind of going about our business and pushed out a message about, don't forget to raise $100 and earn your walk t-shirt. And I remember getting a message, it was actually from a staff person who said, I am sitting in my car to charge my phone to stay on top of emails because we don't have any power. This felt really insensitive to be getting a message about $100 to earn a t-shirt. And it was a great call out because she wasn't, mean about it, but we had not thought about, okay, here's this emergency that has happened. We now need to pivot with an event that's coming up in a few weeks just to be sensitive, to be sensitive and relevant to the market that we're sending to. And so I feel like that, especially for some of our organizations that, emergency response isn't, kind of their core mission, thinking about that when emergency strikes, like what's that going to do to your existing event that might be a month away and you don't want to miss out. You don't want to, you don't want to pause everything, but you want to be respectful and appropriate with your messages and your timing and your targeting.
That's a great point. We actually do, and I just spoke to, disaster fundraising sensitivities, but as far as our regular programs, we do pause everything. Depending on the size of the disaster, everything goes on pause, and we really focus solely on that disaster and the needs of those people. So it can be disappointing if you spend all year planning something and then you have to pause it or reschedule it. But yeah, you want to remain sensitive and make sure you're really talking about what's important during that time.
So let's talk about messaging. So obviously disaster response, it's really emotionally charged and it evolves quickly, right? Whether it's, again, I keep using the LA fires just as one of, not even the most recent example, but it feels like one of the most recent examples where, every day it was, moving to a new community or kind of impacting a new group of people. How do you navigate, that donor sentiment over time and like choose the right message and the right channel for each kind of stage of like the immediate need to, or the immediate emergency to the aftermath to even the rebuild?
Yeah. So we do change our communication strategies based on timelines as well as geographically, like I just discussed. So those sentiment changes are important as we get further away from when the disaster strikes, and all channels kind of follow the same cadence, if you will. So if we know a disaster is coming, sometimes in advance a crisis might occur. Sometimes it might be political and you've heard about it on the news, it's coming. You can start putting out communication in advance of the disaster actually hitting the ground. So the language we put out there is what the disaster is and who's going to be affected, what that impact might be and when. And our images are generally weather maps and icons because it hasn't happened yet. We don't have any photography. Once that disaster hits, though, we're really talking about the destruction of the disaster. We're changing all our language to say how severe it was. Obviously, we're no longer saying it's coming, it's here. What was the level of damage it caused and where was that damage? What are the communities that were affected? And then the imagery really changes to, if we have it, the destruction, the broken houses, the power lines down, people, in boats, people in rowboats going down streets, which is always really, really sad to see. So then when that time is right, we switch to talking about our response and how we're helping. So how many people need food or water, shelter, supplies. The images change to probably people in shelters, us serving food to communities. It's getting a little more lighthearted. It's getting a little bit more helpful. And then during the tail end of it being in the media and the response, probably the remainder of our fundraising, we pivot to more of a comfort and hope messaging, the help that we gave, the places that your money went, and how the community is recovering. So even more leaning towards that more hopeful messaging. And the timeline on this language really depends on how fast your response is, right? Some communities will be in that middle stage for longer than others. But just changing your language throughout that disaster cycle is really important to just remain responsive to where the community is at that time.
Well, and I'm listening to you talk about all these emergencies and how you prepare, but I also think sometimes it's the preparing for the rapid response to something positive, right? I know that may not be the world you live in as much, but I remember we had someone speak at the conference from the ALS Association talking about the Ice Bucket Challenge. And he said how internally they thought of it as disaster response fundraising because it was responding to something that was in the news cycle that was getting such press that they kind of had to be ready as if, something, unexpected was happening, like an emergency, even though it was a positive thing. Or I remember hearing a presentation from someone who worked at the Human Rights Campaign and how they said they had like 6 hours notice. I mean, this was a long time ago when Obama came out in favor of gay marriage, and they had like 6 hours notice that was going to come out. And so how did they push out this rapid response fundraising campaign to something positive in the news? So I also think, it's not fun always to sit there and imagine the emergency, the disaster, right? But thinking of it as how do we plan for, what's the plan we put in place for the unexpected? And it could be something positive. We've mentioned political disasters. I know there's a lot of people, a lot of organizations that are responding to changes in whether it's Medicaid and Medicare coverage, whether it's impact on research, just with different changes in the administration, or it could be a new drug gets announced that is going to help everyone and you want to take advantage of it being in the media cycle. So I think that's one of the things I'm kind of noodling on of how do we get people thinking about those SOPs so they can react in a negative situation or in a positive situation to the media.
Just being nimble no matter what.
Yeah. So let's just talk about after the fact. So once that immediate crisis has passed, right? How do you assess the success of your campaign? And then how are you also stewarding or kind of acquiring donors who gave during that kind of immediate moment of need?
So the success of our campaign really depends on the unique disaster goals. Obviously, every single one has a different goal and measurement, but it is really important to not stop talking to these donors after the disaster ends. So a crisis or disaster can really introduce a unique and new audience to your organization, and having a plan to just turn these supporters into long-term donors or fundraisers or sustainers, both on the corporate and individual side, is wise. So if they gave enough within your organizational structure to pass them on to like a personal relationship manager or fundraiser staff to then go ahead and thank and steward them in their long-term portfolio, definitely go ahead and do that. We pass those names on at the end of a disaster, as well as over to the corporate teams. But if they gave a lower amount, you can put them into a cross-channel marketing strategy, which is my bread and butter. So maybe you see if they'll respond to an email or a text or a phone call or a direct mail piece. I could go on and on. A social media campaign. We really tap them on all the areas. And then we also provide them activities to fundraise again and the tools and resources to make that turnkey. If they were fundraising for us, we ask them, do they possibly want to become monthly donors? And then if they don't respond to any of this over the course of maybe a year, there's a possibility that these donors are just one-time crisis-only donors. And that is okay. I still wouldn't get rid of them in your data systems yet. We do keep a segment of disaster-only donors available in case there's another large disaster that occurs that's similar to the one they gave to, so that we can reach out to them again, because that's obviously the one cause they care the most about. But most importantly, don't forget to update this audience on your organization's response to the disaster or the crisis. So we send a 1 month, 6 month, and 1 year stewardship update to those who supported that specific disaster, just to let them know how we responded in that community and the impact that their gift has had and on change in that community. So that alone can just inspire giving again, but it's also a really good way to just stay in touch with them.
Yeah. Well, I think it's we talk about this a lot in peer-to-peer about it's acknowledging why someone gave, right? If we just assume everyone gave because they just like the American Red Cross, and we're missing out on the fact that whether somebody gave because their best friend asked them to, or because the disaster impacted where their best friend lives, and that is what inspired them to give. I think being able to always tie back to you gave for this disaster, or you gave for this marathon that someone was running. Anytime you could call back to this is what motivated you to give, I feel like is critical to just reminding them that you know them, how you know them, what's important to them, and can then build that relationship there. So I think that's spot on, Jessi.
That's the beauty of peer-to-peer, right? It could be an acquisition channel, but you have to teach them why they should give to your organization again sometimes.
Exactly. So if there are people listening in and thinking, where can I learn more about the American Red Cross and what they're doing, how can we send people to get involved with your organization?
Yeah, so you can come visit us at redcross.org and join any of our peer-to-peer campaigns. Would love to have you. And on socials, we are at American Red Cross, and I lead our social fundraising. So come say hi to me on there as well.
Awesome. Well, Jessi, thank you so much. I think there's something we can all take away, even if the emergency response is not our bread and butter. I think you had some really great takeaways that can benefit us all in the world of peer-to-peer. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much. It was great to be here.
The P2P Soap Box is produced in partnership with True Story FM. Engineering by Pete Wright. Music this week is by Balloon Planet. If your podcast app allows ratings and reviews, we hope you'll consider doing just that for our show. But the best thing that you can do to support the P2P Soap Box is simply to share the show with a friend or colleague. Thank you for listening, and we'll be back in September.